Hey everyone, this is Jonah Johnson with you for another edition of JJ in the Field.
Hey guys, Jonah Johnson, Sales Agronomist with PCT Sunrise. Here today we are in South Central Ohio, and obviously behind me my backdrop is we're looking at some corn. And so for most of us here in Ohio this year, we've been dealing with, ups and downs of weather, erratic rainfalls in the first half of the season. Now unfortunately we're getting to the dry dog days of late July, and so we're coming into August now, and a lot of places in Ohio have got some timely rains here or there, but for most of us we are very dry. And so as we're in this time of season now, we should be looking at your corn for corn diseases. And so a lot of our different diseases, typically we need some relative humidity, we need some moisture on the plant tissue, and we also need moderate temperatures. Anything like we've had in the last 2 weeks and what we see coming in the near forecast of in the upper 90s, that's going to do some suppression of our major diseases in corn. And so today we're going to talk about how to scout for corn diseases. And obviously behind me we're just getting close to tasseling and realizing a lot of corn in Ohio has started to tassel, and fungicides have already been put on in many areas, but there's a lot of us that aren't quite there yet. So a quick review on our major corn diseases in Ohio. Our predominant diseases are gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, and a rather new one for us here in Ohio that started coming in Ohio about 2 years ago, tar spot, and then southern rust, which is a disease that shows up not very frequently. It blows up from the south. It's a tropical disease, usually follows hurricanes up in the trade winds, and usually that's something we haven't really seen a big impact since about 2016 here in Ohio. When we were looking at the corn canopy, we want to start depending on what disease we're looking at. So let's talk about gray leaf spot. Always as we look for diseases, this field's pretty clean, and that's a good thing for the grower. So gray leaf spot, it typically comes in from the bottom, lives on residue, and works its way up in the bottom of the canopy. So the first thing I like to do is when you go into the canopy, look at these lower leaves. Are there any type of lesions, gray leaf spot? And I'll draw some of these how to look for those. Might be a little bit here on this very lower leaf. That's probably more or less just some insect feeding, but you'll start to see some spores form. So when gray leaf spot starts to form, it moves up in the upper canopy. Northern corn leaf blight, that disease typically comes in from the top, it can be blown in. That's why we can see a lot of that happen late in the season. So a lot of times we'll see that in the upper canopy. Tar spot, that can be in the upper 2/3 of the canopy as well, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But basically when we're scouting for disease, you want to start monitoring, find that ear leaf. So on this plant here is the profile ear. That is the primary ear set on this corn plant right here. And so this is where the silks will emerge. Once the tassels obviously come down, we get into pollination on this field. But this is the primary photosynthetic source that's going to store energy and provide carbohydrates and starch into that ear, and when we start to feel kernel fill later in the season. So this leaf is the most important leaf, and of course this upper part of the canopy is our most photosynthetic factory, if you will, that's going to encapsulate again for grain fill. So these are the leaves that we're most interested in protecting, with a fungicide application if it is warranted. And I want to talk about this today because we may be in spots of Ohio that, besides stress mitigation and some of the positives that fungicides bring corn and our soybeans, it may not be warranted this year in all reality. So that's something that you got to figure out on your own, your farm. But we'll talk a little bit about that identification here right now. So Lil, if you remember, and again, I'll put some pictures in here, but if we talk about gray leaf spot, these are the veins that you'd find in the corn leaves. Gray leaf spot always has those irregular lesions, and they'll stack up, but they never cross. And so when you start to have multiple lesions form across the leaf, that's when you start knocking out the chloroplast, or the green part of the leaf, and essentially that's what will kill the leaf and obviously harm the plant. When we go to northern corn leaf blight, you always use the analogy of the brown cigar lesions. So those lesions can actually cross the leaf veins, and so when they get really big, depending on your natural resistance of the hybrid, you may have small lesions, you may have large lesions, but they'll always cross those leaf veins. And when you start to get a lot of these lesions on there, that's when we can see overall eventually plant death ultimately. But when we start knocking out our solar panels on the big leaves that are the big contributors, that's a problem. Tar spot, a rather new disease in Ohio, up in north central Ohio, was found 2 years ago and a couple fields last year as well. If you remember the seasons though, 2018 was a more wet year. We had moderate temperatures, so it really favored that disease. And so on tar spot, you'll start to see little black dots that'll start to form randomly around the plant. And these spots can sometimes be mistaken for insect feces. So if you want to go in there, get a little bit of water, a little bit of saliva, and try to scratch those spots off. If they come off, then it's not tar spot. So there's two genus species of tar spot, and the one that's primarily in Ohio is P. matus, Phyllocora matus. And so when that gets bad or gets tagged with M. matus, the second portion of it, we can also start to see these halos wrapped around there. And that's still associated with the P. matus. So you'll get these tan halos with these black dots in the center there. And so that disease can reproduce quite quickly. You know, our counterparts in Michigan and Indiana have seen quite a big response when they had tar spot show up in their fungicide trials. So the good news is that most of our fungicides now, our major fungicides, dual modes, are labeled for tar spot, and they do a pretty good job. So it's just more or less scouting and knowing whether or not those are inside your field. Okay, so in regards to disease scouting, a lot of people have kind of forgotten this over the years, you know, the easy button spraying a fungicide. And again, fungicides do what they're stated to do. They stop disease. And so with our environment, even though I mentioned it's been very hot and a lot of absence of water, we got to think about there is still the evening temperature. So you think about it's been still in those 75, 85 degree temperature ranges. And some nights we do have a dew, sometimes we have some fogs in there. And anytime we have extended periods of leaf wetness, so if you know you have spots in your farms that along creeks, tree lines that's going to stay wet, you know, that extended 10, 12, 15 hours of leaf wetness during the day, and say you have a hybrid that has a low tolerance to the disease defending itself against that, those are all good candidates where you'd want to focus your fungicide applications if you're still kind of hedging on whether or not do I do everything or do I start doing fields that maybe have a higher risk. And so when we do that, thresholds are not very well established for all the corn diseases. Gray leaf spot has a disease threshold of 5%, and northern corn leaf blight follows suit. There's not really a disease that the pathologists have established for northern corn leaf blight, but on gray leaf spot, if I look into the canopy and I start to see disease building, I'll go up to the ear leaf, and so to evaluate, and obviously this is an extremely clean leaf, and I'll insert a picture on how to, you know, the grid system of how to look at, you know, when you start to see what does 5% look like in a leaf. But an easy way to do that is you can take it and just rip them by your hands, but I'll take a pair of shears and I'll cut the leaves down. So when you have this corn leaf now, when you cut that in half and you start evaluating diseases, normally you start to see the diseases towards the latter part of the plant. So at this point you can start making a grid system and to make this easier to quantify. And so at this point we have a 50-50 plant leaf. And so if you take it again and you cut it in half one more time, now you have a grid system. So if I don't have a certain amount of disease, let's say these, being that they're clean, we can take these out. So we just removed 50%. So your total maximum here is 50% disease expression. Then we start to zoom in, you can start, say the disease lesions were up here on this portion of the leaf. So if this was your expression, so we said this was clean, we got rid of that. Now 25% is the maximum potential out of this plant. And then at this point we can start to break that down. So you could take this part of the leaf out, you could take this part of the leaf out, and then you could start to quantify. If I have a maximum, if this was 25% and we took these two sections out, approximately have about half of that, if you will. So now we have a maximum of about, let's just say 12%. And then you can start to quantify and estimate, and these are crude estimations obviously, but estimate what you like for your gray leaf spot issue is in the field. Another thing you can do is that you can take the leaves and you can hold them up to the sunlight, and if you can see the lesions from the sunlight through the back and you can see yellow halos around there, that's a very good thing. That's the plant trying to defend itself against the disease. If you don't see that plant probably has less resistance to the overall disease. There's a lot of variables out there in the fields right now. You know, please reach out to us if you have questions on trying to identify disease, number one, and then number two, whether or not it's worth to actually apply a fungicide this year. You know, again, they will stop diseases. We still have the nighttime temperatures that can impact us. So gray leaf spot, in summary, it likes warmer temperatures up in those mid-80s with some humidity. Northern corn leaf blight likes the cooler temperatures, 60 to probably upper 70s with some moisture. But then you get in a tar spot, like it's a more moderate temperature disease. And then of course our southern rust, it likes warmer temperatures. So if that did get moved up, you know, southern Kentucky already confirmed some of that this year. But I don't know if it's going to be a big economic problem for us in Ohio this year, because we'll be too far along by the time it gets here most likely. So with that, your conditions, just kind of take that in the back of your mind. So again, they'll stop disease, they'll help with disease, they will help with stress in the mitigation within the plant. But a couple misnomers, as we've seen some nasty storms come across Ohio. Guys that before tassel were, had some major hail events, some snapping of the corn, some bending over the corn. They said, what if I use a fungicide to help that plant recover? So that kind of conceptually makes sense, but in all reality, that's not going to actually help that plant. So it'll help diseases that come in the plant through the leaf surface. That's disease where it goes in the plant through the leaf surface, but it doesn't help trying to go through like the stalks and any major broken proponents of that plant. You'd be much better ahead using some type of nutrition like a calcium and some other micronutrients to help that plant recover much quicker. Now, where you would get a benefit from that, if you're fighting any bacterial diseases, if you use a bactericide, that would help something like that after a hail event that broke that plant open. So with that, hope you found some tips out of this for this week. This is Jonah Johnson, Sales Agronomist with the PCT Sunrise. Thanks for watching.